Hello, hello, folks. All right, we're back on time. How exciting. Uh, Hi, my name is Ben Bond. I am one of the core council members here. I have been running tech, so if you've not noticed problems, that's a miracle. Uh, and I have the immense and extraordinary privilege of introducing our next plenary speaker, uh, Dr. Allison Hampton. I have had the pleasure of getting to know Dr. Hampton over the past couple years now. She was a fellow with our organization that I work for, Disability Belongs. She is still recounted as one of the greatest contributions to our organizations ever. People often rewatch a lot of the things she says, and even some of the most corporate folks just are brought to tears by the things that she is, the wisdom she imparts on all of us. So um, I'm going to share a little bio. This is also the Bill Gaventa lecture. And I was introduced to Allison through Bill. Bill is often really good at connecting people and was the founder of this particular conference. So Allison Hampton is a disability advocate, speaker, author, board certified Christian life coach, and owner of Arise Life Coaching, LLC. Dr. Hampton is an alumnus of the National Leadership Program of Disability Belongs, where she was awarded the Spangenberg Memorial Chapel Award for demonstrating a deep commitment to advancing the disability community in policy, entertainment, and philanthropy. She's also the founder of a nonprofit organization called Living Chronic Faith Incorporated. This faith-first nonprofit organization serves an online community designated or designed to encourage and empower people living with chronic medical conditions to maximize their quality of life and live towards their God-given purposes. Despite their physical limitations, Hampton holds a Master's of Divinity from Southeastern University and a Doctor of Ministry in Pastoral Counseling from Liberty University. She is the author of Chronic Faith, A Believer's Approach to Chronic Illness and Pain, and Challenged and Chosen, Finding Your Identity in God, Not a Chronic Diagnosis. Her passion for advocacy is driven by her personal experience with overcoming limitations and her belief that every person is God's workmanship, created with the capacity to do everything God has called them to do. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Allison Hampton with us, and I'm so honored and grateful you all get the privilege of getting to hear her speak. With that, let's welcome Allison.
Yeah. Good morning. Thank you, Ben, for that amazing introduction. What a blessing it is to be with all of you in person, as well as those joining us in the online space. This has been such just an amazing place to grow, to think together, to discover new ways of processing. And what a way to grow in the things that God has called us to do. Certainly, I honor God for this opportunity. I want to thank the coordinating council for this amazing invitation, as well as all of the incredible work that has gone into this amazing conference. Thank you to St. Thomas University for all of the accommodations and for giving us a remarkable experience. And thanks to all of you for sharing in this time, for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you. This morning, I want to share a little bit about dignifying lament, the sacred nature of grief, its role in human flourishing. And I want to thank Robert for kind of giving us a wonderful segue this morning. Dr. Hardwick was certainly a huge impact in my life, in my work, the gold standard, I would say, of disability theology and advocacy. And so with that, I would like to just start off by sharing a quote. And if we could go ahead to that slide, thank you. By the way, I'd like to share an image description. I am, I'll follow in Robert's lead, an attractive African-American female. I am wearing a teal top, a teal head wrap, large gold earrings, and I'll be wearing red reading glasses. And again, I can't overstate, I'm delighted to be with you. I have enjoyed meeting you and having conversations, and I look forward to more. So let's begin. This quote says, "I was dispossessed by grief. I cried because there was no getting better in my future, though I did everything I could to recover strength and function, both in months of hospitalization and for another year and a half of outpatient therapy. I worked hard to regain range and strength in my arms and to learn how to move and care for my paralyzed body. To be struck by catastrophic injury the moment I turned 50 seemed just too cruel a fate. I felt strong and young and happy, even as the calendar pointed to my later years. I didn't want a support group. I was just infinitely sad." This is just part of Christina Crosby's reflection of the disability grief experienced following a cycling accident that left them with a spinal cord injury. As a result, they found themselves trying to make sense of life after disability, navigate all the changes, and figure out who they could be now. What Crosby, like I would imagine most of us, found is that there is no one-size-fits-all disability identity. There are so many variations of disability and diagnoses that even our spectrums can have spectrums. Crosby notes that even the social model of disability can only ever be a model, a suggestion. Despite the model's emphasis on pride and self-identification that counters pity by focusing on the disabling nature of external factors like inaccessible environments and stigma. Discussing chronic pain itself is still difficult, both physical pain and that of grief. And in their quest for resources to help them make meaning of their injury, Crosby could find little writing in the discipline of disability studies that centered mourning. Crosby could not find their experience in the literature. They write, "I will never again be buoyant with joy or blissfully overcome. Losses that continue to be painful all these years later, I can be happy and my life is abundant, but I will mourn forever my strong and eminently capable body. These truths are hardly speakable in the critical discourse of disability. The field is reticent on the subject of pain and about grief, nearly silent as the grave." Next slide, please. Countless others like Crosby bear the weight of that grief silently because they struggle to find a socially acceptable place to express and process that deep sense of loss. Society is much more comfortable with people with disabilities who present as what Crosby calls a testament of human resilience and triumph of the will. Where have we heard that before? Potentially because people are not equipped to accompany us through the process of grieving disease progression, loss of independence, positions for which we're qualified but will be overlooked, and relationships that cannot sustain last-minute cancellations. To say nothing of the pain, physical limitations, expense, and stigma that are par for the course. Unfortunately, this trend extends even to communities of faith, places expected to be havens of rest and sanctuaries from the cruelties of life. In her book, Hurting Yet Whole, Luann Huska compares faith communities to country clubs. It's not the place, she says, to talk about your problems. People are not accepting when you say you struggle with your faith because of condition XYZ. I've been in many different churches. Finding those pockets of supportive people is hard. Barbara Brown Taylor, an American Episcopal priest, refers to this as the full sun effect, explaining that although her soul operates like the moon, rising in different phases based on different life events, never looking the same 2 nights in a row, she still felt compelled to present as all sunshine in her ministry context. Consequently, she observed a similar pattern among parishioners, noting that when overwhelmed by life's challenges, they tended to disappear from the church instead of finding refuge in it. She wrote in part, "I was sorry that the church did not strike these wounded souls as a place they could bring the dark fruits of their equally dark nights. Sometimes," she says, "I could almost read the truth written above people's heads. Please don't believe me. This is only a shard of who I really am." The cost of the pretense was the loss of the real human texture underneath. But since we all thought that was what was expected of us, that's what we delivered. In his exploration of the connection between grief and faith, Roger Murchison relates the perspectives of two participants in one of the many grief ministry workshops that he has led. One participant, Don, remarked, "If Christians respond to grief in a bad way or a negative way, that means that their faith before the loved one's death was not what it should be. It was God's will that my wife died, and that is the end of that." Another participant, Mary, said, "I link my weekdays emotionally with my faith. If my faith was as strong as it should be, I should accept the fact that it was time for my husband to die. But there are moments when I cannot accept that, and that is not good. My mother tells me to trust God. Sometimes that does not seem to be enough. I have questioned my faith through this grief process. My mother told me that God gives and God takes away." Next slide, please. This cause and effect relationship to which Don and Mary seem to subscribe is not uncommon in faith spaces. The consensus seems to be strong faith leads to mature grief response. Weak faith leads to immature grief response. And while Don and Mary's grief was related to the death of a spouse, the expectation is the same across the board. Faith is often seen as the purported mitigator of the impact of grief. Glenn Davidson, in his book, Understanding Mourning, suggests that one's faith is never more decisively revealed than in one's reaction to loss. While we all can agree that faith can play a significant role in the processing of grief, it bears considering the position Granger E. Westberg takes in his book, Good Grief. Depending upon the way we respond to this event, grief, we are either stronger people than we were before or weaker, either healthier in spirit or sicker. So I want to spend our time together thinking about how faith communities can become spaces in which people become healthier in spirit and better equipped to manage that response. Research indicates that lament can stimulate the biological healing of the brain, leading to healthy processing of trauma and difficult emotions such as grief. Next slide, please. The Hebrew word safad appears about 32 times in the Old Testament, always in reference to the act of mourning, lamenting, wailing, or grieving, whether by individuals or communities. We also find pentheo, the word often translated as mourning from its Greek root, meaning to experience sadness as the result of some condition or circumstance. Be sad, grieve. Beyond just sadness, though, mourning is to grieve deeply about something or someone, whether expressed or unexpressed outwardly, as a result of a variety of causes, including but not limited to loss of health, job, relationships, divorce, infertility, infidelity, retirement, loss of relationship with God, and even living in a war zone. To be clear, grief encompasses a spectrum of emotional, physiological, cognitive, and behavioral reactions to loss. And mourning pertains to the personal or cultural practices through which that grief is expressed. While faith communities are renowned for meal trains and covered dishes, visits, phone calls, and lovely cards in the mail for the couple of weeks following major surgery or hospitalization, they can be largely unaware of the profound sense of loss that persists and how it can affect the impacted person. Next slide, please. According to the National Institutes of Health, grief can cause bodily pain, a weakened immune system, gastrointestinal issues, and fatigue. Loss can be interpreted by the body and brain as an injury, triggering them to instinctively go on high alert to protect them from further losses or perceived injuries. Thus, the immune system ramps up and it sends immune cells throughout the body to deal with possible physical wounding that might occur, thus helping to greatly accelerate wound healing and recovery. That's how the body understands grief. We understand that to be survival mode, don't we? And this survival mode can lead to increases in cortisol, which can be harmful if experienced over long periods of time. In fact, according to a 2009 study by UCLA Health, prolonged grief can be debilitating for some and is associated with more serious health consequences, such as increased risk for cancer and early mortality. Inflammation can also lead to several physical symptoms across the body, including pain and changes in the gut microbiome. Grief that is not expressed or even properly processed is often recycled, suppressed, and/or carried within the soul from season to season, especially when it is compounded by what Maxwell and Perrin refer to as other people's morally charged evaluations of the grief process, whether it should be fast or slow, whether God is necessary or unhelpful, and whether grief is proper. What if our faith communities were safe spaces where people weren't compelled to rush through their mourning to present the full sun effect? How can faith spaces help people acknowledge, address, and assign a healthy place to their grief? Before we get there, someone is certain to ask, why faith spaces? Let me tell you about Grace. Grace, a young woman who has experienced chronic migraine since the age of 3, has learned in community how to grieve all that she has lost because of pain and considers it part of her spiritual growth. She testifies, there's a role and a place and a discipline to it. The idea of crying out to God. There's a space for frustration and anger and verbalizing these things publicly and privately. Huska suggests that spaces of lament help the grieving individual deep into pain. And Henri Nouwen, renowned theologian, seems to agree. He said, when people come with their loneliness to ministers, they can only expect that their loneliness will be understood and felt so that they no longer have to run away from it, but can accept it as an expression of the basic human condition. So Huska concludes that the church's role in helping to relieve pain and suffering is to help people face it and embrace it, to love them while bringing the pain down to a shared level, thereby lightening the burden. Why faith spaces? Because for generations, faith spaces have been gathering places for community events and meetings, polling places for elections, temporary shelters for victims of natural disasters. They have housed soup kitchens and food pantries, health fairs and clothing donations, toy drives, and safe alternatives for holiday festivities. All these endeavors were in an effort to meet the needs of their respective communities. Next slide, please. Perhaps even more compelling, however, is the fact that the religious and spiritual dimension of grief influences the way we understand and cope with grief. Numerous studies have examined religious grief rituals, the impact of religious beliefs and commitments where grief is concerned, and other related topics. Guidance regarding lament and mourning can be found in most, if not all, religious texts. Next slide. Buddhist Four Noble Truths center on the nature and cessation of human sufferings. The teachings characterize suffering as negative reactions triggered by losses in the form of aging, death, and separation from loved ones, which may present as sorrow and grief. In the Quran, verse 84 of Surah Yusuf indicates that the chronic pressure of grief can affect the body in critically negative ways, including severe and potentially fatal sadness. The Quran further reports that when people experience severe discomfort, not only do they lose the confidence to cope with it, but they also become disappointed and desperate. Quranic thoughts include both strategies to restructure or modify attitudes and perceptions, and to help people accept their reality as being under God's lordship, and that some things that happen are simply unavoidable. Kandani et al. Submit that listening to others carefully, having knowledge and being proud of one's own dignity and ability, believing in divine laws and traditions, and trusting divine invisible blessings are believed to be curative for grief and sorrow. The observance of Jewish tradition would be incomplete without communal days of mourning based on the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and other tragedies. The late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks stated, "In Judaism, we emerge from the pain of loss by re-immersing ourselves in life, and thus in God, the source of all life. Rather than avoid grief, catharsis, growth, and even relief can be found in locating oneself in the grief of their forebears, rehearsing their paths through sorrow, and sitting in appreciation and acceptance of life's difficulties." Realistically, though, faith tradition notwithstanding, lament can accomplish what the most cogent theological arguments fail to do. See, acknowledging God and looking to Him for strength and guidance helps some people process their grief. But for others, God's presence further exacerbates the difficulty and guilt experienced in that process. For example, being sad about a loss is normalized and affirmed for a limited time in some communities. But elsewhere, and sometimes after the unspoken, culturally agreed upon, acceptable period of mourning, that same sadness is seen as indicative of a lack of faith. Therefore, the danger of addressing grief with theology is that it can inevitably reduce a complex and often bewildering phenomenon to a constraining ideology that may even result in the imposition of harm rather than grief, or rather than relief. Through lament, instead, grief can become a sacred encounter when it is surrendered to God with confidence in His loving care and compassion. In the next slide, we see Psalm 34:18, which reminds us, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Lament is the expression of grief, and those expressions will be as varied as the individuals expressing it. From Moses to Mordecai, from Jesus to Paul, we see lament presenting in different ways throughout the Bible. As with most things that humanity tries to understand by establishing a singular definition, the process of navigating grief has been analyzed and structured in a series of models. Let's look at how grief has been explained over the years. Next slide. Sigmund Freud thought grief was processed in a progressive sequence, with the grieving person walking through a linear set of steps that resulted ultimately in resolution. This idea of grief steps gains steam in America by way of John Bowlby and Colin Murray Parks, their phase theory. This grief navigation sequence became known as the Bowlby-Parks model, which was based on 4 phases: numbness, yearning and searching, disorganization and despair, and reorganization. Now, if that sounds familiar, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross built on this model in her famous book on death and dying, in which she reconfigured the phase theory into what we know as the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, acceptance. In her theory, grief must necessarily be processed in this precise order with no room for rearrangement. In fact, when we hear of people doing grief work, it typically refers to this process, fully implying that every person who suffers loss must not only process their grief, but must also successfully promote themselves through the 5 progressively unfolding emotions. Well, anyone who's ever grieved anything knows how problematic and unrealistic that is. The major problem with stage models is that they tend to create rigid parameters for proper behavior that do not match what most people go through. What her model did accomplish was that it helped assign a positive function to what had previously been considered negative emotions. But perhaps one of the reasons it doesn't work for grief across the board is because she was specifically researching those who were in the process of dying, not those experiencing other types of loss. What I mean is that accepting the end of life, which also represents the end of pain, looks different than accepting a diagnosis or acquired disability, which represents a life potentially full of pain, limitations, or minimally some significant lifestyle adjustments. Grief research continued to evolve, eventually taking into account the unpredictable and disorganized nature of existential grief. And those who challenged Kubler-Ross and her stage model viewed the essential functions of grief not as a series of stages to work through, but as a search for meaning, a way to understand and orient the loss in one's life so they can find a sustainable way forward. Phyllis R. Silverman and Dennis Klaus, for example, did not view closure or recovery as necessary goals for grief. Rather than emphasizing letting go, the emphasis should be on negotiating and renegotiating the meaning of the loss over time. More recently, at Columbia University, clinical psychology professor George Bonanno introduced the trajectory model, which observes individual patterns instead of mandating progressive stages. People respond to grief differently, and the response to that is not to police them all through the same sequence, but to identify which of many legitimate directions their grief will take them. The 5 possible trajectories include resilience, someone who is relatively unaffected by their grief; relief, someone who experiences a nearly immediate sense of resolution; recovery, one who finds a way to return to pre-loss emotional life; recurrence, one who experiences chronic grief; and reprieve, one whose grief experience is delayed grief, as in one who experiences trauma. The trajectory model changes at the framework level the entire dynamic of grief from one progress to one of process. One caveat to deepening the pain, as Huska promotes, is that it is possible to dwell in grief to the point that it becomes pathological. This is a precarious possibility for those who subscribe to thinkers like Soren Kierkegaard, who, instead of moving forward from the grief of loss, recommends that one should embrace it and permit it to strengthen the relationship with God. David Switzer denotes pathological grief as a fixation on a particular symptom or experience of the grief. A healthy grief process involves experimenting with different various behavioral responses over time, discarding those that do not contribute to maintaining and reordering one's life and wellness, and adopting those behaviors that lead to growth and adaptivity. In lieu of, or in addition to, existing grief frameworks, Roger Murchison advocates for reframing, which encourages people to look at the circumstances of their grief from a new perspective. Though the loss remains unchanged, what does change is the way people understand and respond to the loss. Just as a painting takes on new dimensions when given a new frame, people who reframe their grief can discover new sources of strength. And this is the function of lament as we observe it in the Bible. It was a way that individuals and communities dissected the loss, examined it, and defined it in ways that felt manageable and sustainable for them. While no single biblical lament example is prescriptive for those walking through grief at present, perhaps the diversity of those recorded expressions is part of the revelation. That lament is both subjective and welcomed by God. In fact, trauma studies reveal that such narratives in their testimonial and emotive power serve as survival literature for the community, providing avenues of resiliency and opening the potential for moving through trauma toward hope and recovery. With that in mind, I'd like to consider together how grief was processed through lament in the lives of the people in the Bible. Let's look at a couple of case studies. According to Cataldo, texts that are written to tell a traumatic story are done so after an event in order to make sense of not the event itself, but how it can be categorized within the collective psyche. This is why we often find ourselves ruminating on certain events. We are consciously or subconsciously aware of the changes to the way our worlds have been ordered and are often attempting to negotiate the place that said changes will occupy in our lives. In fact, one theory suggests that an experience itself is not what causes the effect of trauma, but how a loss is perceived and retold, especially when its effects are understood to have significant implications on one's present and future. Thus, I submit that one way faith communities can help its members process grief is by exploring the language of lament. In his book about the biblical text, Lamentations, Delbert Hillers contends, Lamentations is so complete and honest and eloquent an expression of grief that even centuries after the events which inspired it, it is still able to provide those in mute despair with words to speak. So let's begin our exploration there. Next slide, please. The 5 chapters of the book of Lamentations takes the reader on a journey from disobedience through exile to possibility and new expectation. They comprise a consolation dialogue and create a sense of sympathy and unity among the people, guiding them as they wrestle with questions of theodicy and anxious thoughts. This helps them make the transition from despair to hope in their own context. The first 2 chapters describe the sad state of Israel following their exile. In fact, this is how chapter 1 opens. Next slide. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. And it goes on and on. And after 2.5 chapters of this desolation, the writer arrives at this conclusion in chapter 3. Next slide. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet, this I recall to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will wait for him. Subsequently, in chapters 4 and 5, the author of the book returns the reader and the lamenter to the same situations described in chapters 1 and 2. This time, however, there is moderate hope, which is most succinctly addressed by allowing the lamenter to direct their grievance to God in prayer. This can be seen in Lamentations 5, which begins, remember, Lord, what has happened to us. Look and see our disgrace. So Cataldo concludes that structure, metaphors, and themes of Lamentations attempt to reframe trauma in a way that helps the community make meaning of not just their present, but their future as well. The author of the text utilized the cultural language to interpret their collective grief in a way that anticipates God's grace and restoration. Hillers agrees. He writes, from near despair, this everyman wins through to confidence that God's mercy is not at an end, and that his final inmost will for man is not suffering. In the 5th chapter of Matthew, we find Jesus on a mountain teaching a multitude principles for living a blessed, fulfilled life. The Beatitudes describe the countercultural character of true believers. All their attributes are the direct antithesis of ordinary secular values. They are the humble in heart, the merciful, the pure in heart, and peacemakers. Well, Jesus reframes them to reveal the elusive merits of those attributes. And among those curious tenets, he stated, next slide, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed. In the Greek, makarioi, interpreted fortunate or well off. Exploration of that logic may very well begin with the phrase, those who mourn, which suggests that there are those who do not or will not mourn. Could this refer to those who suppress their grief and suffer in silence, or perhaps to those who languish in their grief but do not allow themselves the gift of expressing it, trapping themselves in an emotional purgatory? Could it be a suggestion that no person who wholeheartedly engages their faith can escape the challenges that accompany righteous living, and for whom some level of loss is inevitable? However it is interpreted, we can infer that comfort is the outcome for those who mourn or express and process their feelings of grief. And when done in community, Huskett encourages healing occurs in the safe presence of someone who shares our pain and who helps us hold our pain in new ways, ways that don't obliterate us. Naomi is an example of one who found comfort when she finally expressed her grief. Having fled Bethlehem for Moab with her family during a famine, she soon became a widow who had buried both of her sons. Everything about her response, as recorded in the book of Ruth, was quite pragmatic. She made the decision to return to Bethlehem, where the famine had ended, and she would be among her community. She released her daughters-in-law from any obligation to her and attempted to send them back to the stability of their mother's homes and to a potential fresh start that she herself could not provide for them. All very logical next steps. But the account reveals that her profound sorrow had been festering into bitterness under the surface of her efficiency. And is it coincidental that she does not lament aloud until she returns to her community? That she suffers in silence, next slide please, until those who are familiar enough with her countenance to recognize the difference address her pain, until she feels seen. She tells her friends, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Murchison observes Naomi has become more than just a grieving widow. She has become the personification of grief. The contrast between the old Hebrew name Naomi, meaning pleasant or sweet, and the new name Mara, meaning bitter and sad, points out that Naomi has allowed grief to transform her entire life. Her grief response, however, led her to a safe place in which she finally found the liberty of lament. The account ends in redemption, seen as Boaz assumes responsibility for his relative Elimelech's estate and family, and in the birth of baby Obed, who filled Naomi's empty arms. The ultimate redemption, however, was celebrated in Ruth 4:15, when the women of her community praised God with her, saying, "He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age." Blessed indeed was Naomi, or Mara, who mourned. Lamentations demonstrates how an individual can help the community mourn, while Naomi shows how a community can help the individual process their grief. This cooperative grief is so effective that in the book of Jeremiah, as Israel is poetically compared to a mourning woman, Jeremiah calls for actual mourning women to give voice to Zion's lament. Next slide. In Jeremiah 9, verses 17 and 18, it says, "Consider and call for the mourning women that they may come. Send for the skilled ones that they may come. Let them hurry and lift up a lament over us, that our eyes shed tears and our eyelids overflow with water." Although there are many instances of men in the Hebrew Bible who mourn, these women have a designated role in the community and are described as wise and skillful. Here, the description of the women as skillful suggests those skilled in their craft, able to use various forms of lament. The writer indicates that the mourning women are skilled in lifting up nahi, meaning lament, possibly chants or lament in psalm form. Beale explains the role of the mourning women as a communally oriented one and a well-documented phenomenon in both ancient and contemporary societies of public and communal lamentation, especially weeping at funerals being associated with women, possibly professional mourners. The women function in public performative contexts, and by their expressions of sorrow, they lead the community in lament. This communal function is apparent in the text. For through the women's lament, the community attests that our eyes shed tears and our eyelids overflow with water. But even the lament of professionals could not encompass the profundity of the grief of a nation. In verse 20, the prophet delivers God's command for them to teach the younger women how to lament, presumably so that the skill would not die out with the present generation because the sorrow would outlive them. Juliana Clausens considers professional mourning to be a therapeutic role within that society because it created space for people to cry, lament, and find language to articulate a loss that felt unspeakable. Beale notes that coherent and shared narration of past trauma is a primary means by which individuals and communities reclaim beliefs, values, and identity lost through traumatizing events. Through such means, questions such as why, what now, and who am I can be processed. Among the best known and most relatable of these shared narrations are the Psalms of Lament. Whether reflective of the circumstances of an individual or a nation, the emotions expressed therein are universal, creating a cathartic experience for readers, especially those, next slide, who have been previously unable to give voice to their own grief. The Lament Psalms comprise over a third of the Psalter. Psalms is a valuable resource in understanding ancient Israel's response to grief and how God is a part of the grief faith process. In the 16 community or national laments, for example, Psalms 12, 44, and 74, we find the use of pronouns we, us, and ours as the writer addresses God on behalf of the community. Whereas the 42 individual laments reflect the sorrow of an individual, such as Psalm 3, when David was fleeing his son Absalom, or the especially heavy Psalm 88, that seems to chronicle the long, difficult journey of one who has lived with chronic illness for most of his life. The lament songs reflect the disorienting sorrow of those in distress. A typical lament might open with a cry for help, continue with a detailed complaint, and may at times, though not always, pivot to result in praise or acknowledgement of elements of God's character. While the complaints come out of a real life and concrete situation, the psalmist writes in such a way that other worshipers who come afterwards can use the psalm as a model prayer for similar, though not necessarily identical, situations. Many people with chronic illnesses and disabilities identify closely with Job's extensive lament. After being recommended to Satan by God to demonstrate his faith and obedience, Job endures the loss of property, his children, his health, and even the support of his wife. After more than a week of silence, Job finally opens his mouth and curses the day he was born. Job 3 initiates lament in the process of grief that voices one's agony through existential questions. Next slide, please. Implicating but not yet condemning God's responsibility in his loss. One of the components seen in Job that is different from our previous examples is the dialogue between Job and God. In it, Job's anger, frustration, grief, and despair are clearly expressed, and God does not punish or reject him for it. Rather, he responds with love and corrects his flawed thinking. Thus, the book of Job gives the suffering person the right of human protest. God's responses to Job seem to validate his emotions while affirming their relationship. And the same type of gracious exchange can be observed in the lament of Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19. Over the last 6 decades, biblical scholars' examinations of psychological, social, political, and economic aspects of human suffering have led to studies of religious texts through the lens of trauma. And the potential for those texts to aid in the reconstruction of the shattered implicit self and lost sense of security that stems from loss. Psychological theories also connect lament with the healing of the biological brain and restoration of the soul. How can the lament texts, related hermeneutics, and psychoanalysis research inform the beloved community's role in creating spaces in which everyone can mourn with those who mourn, deepen the pain, reframe their sorrow, and show up unapologetically, no matter what moon phase their lives happen to be in? What is our collective role in promoting human flourishing through the spiritual discipline of lament? Taking the lead from the research and the biblical examples we shared, faith communities can begin by committing to any and or all of the following agreements. Next slide. To listen and be present. Just as God allowed Naomi, Elijah, Job, the psalmist, and countless others to fully express themselves, faith leaders and community members can help by letting people cry, yell, say things they don't really mean in the moment without holding them to it. Engaging the ministry of presence, in which it is not necessary to have the answers for their questions, but the only goal is to make space for their sorrow. Huska notes it becomes less of a burden, at least emotionally, when you can talk about your issues with other people. Next, do not bypass lament in favor of immediate comfort. Embrace the difficult emotions and sit in the lament with them first. Too often people rush to comfort a grieving person because their sorrow feels uncomfortable. Instead, create a safe space for their tears like the mourning women did. Huska advises, let them suffer. Let them feel pain. Don't be so quick to say, God will fix it. Because what if he doesn't? Next, resist the temptation to do the reframing work for them. It may be tempting to qualify the loss, compare it to someone else's situation. For example, at least it's not ... Huska cites the Quaker practice of convening clearness committees, in which a group of community members gather to ask open questions intended to help someone gain insight or make an important decision. The goal is not to provide answers, but to make space for the soul to come out of hiding. Isn't that beautiful? We can exchange the rigidity of linear grief work for the liberty of exploring one's own patterns. To repent from grief, according to the admonishment of Boersma, and to give oneself over to the grief experience, according to J.I. Packer's claim, are both legitimate trajectories of grief, mutually exclusive though they may seem. Both trajectories are possibly appropriate responses rooted in truth, and neither is uniformly necessary for proper grief. Each person must judge for him or herself what feels appropriate to the unique form that grief has taken in their experience. Also, we must recognize that grief and gratitude can coexist. The lament psalms, Job's lament, and the book of Lamentations incorporate praise to God in the midst of the expression of grief, even while resolution and relief are still a distant hope. We can incorporate lament into the liturgy. Just as King David, the author of Lamentations and the mourning women, gave voice to the collective grief of the people, when appropriate, leaders can embrace opportunities to articulate grief over disappointments, pain, and losses felt within the community, the nation, and the world. Modeling prayers of lament and teaching about grief based on sacred texts can introduce individuals to the language of lament, which in turn can lead to their healthy processing of difficult emotions. As Melcher notes, religious practice often leads to cultural representation of normal human physical and mental behavior. And then finally, look for signs of profound or prolonged grief that may need clinical support and be equipped to refer people to trusted providers. While communities of faith are called to mourn with and support each other through loss, it is critical to ensure that those in need of more extensive support are connected to those resources in a timely manner. So to conclude, the fact that sacred texts go into such detail about grief and its expression indicates that it is a significant part of the human experience, one that is important to God. It is incumbent upon communities of faith, not just secular or clinical spaces, to embrace this unique opportunity to restore dignity to the commonly stigmatized process of lament, to the end that those who mourn can experience the blessed outcome that is available for them. As we transition to our discussion, let's reflect on a quote from Tara Lynn St. Elian, who writes about navigating grief in the wake of her mother's stroke. Next slide. She says, "I've now learned how lamenting and trusting in the Lord grant me the freedom to express myself. The intimacy of knowing that the loving God is near to us means that we don't have to be afraid to ask God questions when we don't understand. We can throw our anger at him, knowing he can take it. He won't push us away. It means that blessings and brokenness can occupy the same space." Thank you so much for allowing me to share some thoughts with you. I would love to have an opportunity to hear your thoughts. If we have questions or if this can just be a discussion, I am open to hearing your reflections. Thank you. I know it's a little heavy for 9 o'clock in the morning, but.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I work as a campus pastor with people with disabilities, and I can't tell you, there's probably about 99% of this stuff I'm going to need on that job. But I want to ask you, I'm hearing impaired, I'm deaf, and you may have answered this in your speech, but I'm going to have to read it in my Ollie notes later. What's your suggestion for me? Because I get a lot of students coming up to me and they want immediate solution to their trauma, to their grief. And You're advocating, obviously, as I would, take that slow, long approach and bring things to God and have God reveal things to you. And I'm finding students are just too impatient for that. So I would love to hear if I missed something that you spoke about, if I can have your thoughts on that, please.
Certainly. In my experience with people who want that quick fix for their grief, typically it's because they think they're supposed to have a quick fix. They think that they're supposed to, in some way, get over it. And they feel compelled to respond to the pressure, sometimes outwardly, sometimes inwardly, sometimes from traditions that they've observed. I think in those cases, it can be very helpful to affirm for them the fact that there is no pressure to have a quick fix, to remind them that they're not failing if they haven't gotten over it, that they're not disappointing God, that they're not burdening the world with their grief and with their process, that it's a completely normal human condition to be sad when something hard happens, right? And that it takes time and it's different for everyone. And so sometimes just affirming for a person that they're not wrong because they're sad can be very helpful and give them the space to do the process that they need.
Thank you so much, Allison. We have many, many people giving you claps and celebratory graphics here, and we have a few questions. First, from Mary, Mary says, as St. Augustine wrote after the death of his mother, grief is natural because love is real.
Mm-hmm.
How do we balance cultural expectations of grief, timeline, intensity, with what our true inner journey might be? Waves of grief, triggers of memory, years of long process.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, how do we advocate for a real grief experience versus the expected one?
Thank you for that question. Hi, Mary. So I do think that it starts with, and that's why the question, why faith spaces? It's a place where people are already conditioned to go for emotional support, mental support, support based on their faith. And I think it is important to start with education. I think that we need to be intentional about creating these spaces where grief is normalized, where lament is a thing that is part of our birthright as believers, part of our inheritance, and something that we are entitled to. It's not something that we have to earn or deserve. And I think that as we have those open and candid conversations with people, and they start to see that they're not the only ones. And that's why we took the time to walk through the case studies, because sometimes as we look through biblical examples, it gives us more permission, more freedom, more leverage to be able to, I think, walk through those paths through sorrow, as we talked about. And so maybe creating those paths through sorrow for people. That's why I advocate also for incorporating lament into the liturgy. When you hear it from the pulpit, sometimes it makes it more acceptable. It makes it more personal, more accessible. And so I think that that's a way that we can do that. And then as a community, of course, ministry of presence is so powerful. Being with someone, feeling with someone, that's how we define empathy in mental health spaces, is feeling with someone. And so allowing that to be the case, not trying to process it for them or reframe it for them, but just allowing it to happen so we can face it and embrace it. Thank you for that question.
Okay, question. So we were talking, you were talking about community, faith spaces, and grief. And I would like a word or words, plural, from you on how do we build community when grief intersects with different disabilities?
Mm-hmm.
right? Like community is a cool, sexy, aesthetic word to, let's give them time. But I guess I would love to hear you speak about what happens when someone's grief intersects with their PTSD, with their autism, with Tourette's, any of these things. Like, how do we, I guess what I'm getting at is that can be more chaotic than people know. And what are some things that you would say about how do we build community around grief, knowing that it can intersect with so many social locations and disabilities?
So are you speaking specifically of when my grief collides with your experience or my grief collides with my own other diagnoses?
Yes. But you're the good doctor, so gee, all the above. I'm trying to learn something.
So along with loss and grief education, I think it is important to encourage people to establish healthy boundaries, to observe self-care, to make sure that you are in a place where you can walk alongside someone who is grieving in a healthy way, knowing that if that's not something you have the capacity for, that it may be an opportunity for someone else to minister to them in that way. Certainly not forcing the issue because everyone is in a different place on their journey. Everyone's loss is different. I find that when working with people with chronic diagnoses, someone who was diagnosed yesterday and someone who was diagnosed 20 years ago may have some ways to meet in the middle, but also some very different differences in their experience that may make it difficult for them to relate to one another. Whereas someone who has figured out how to navigate the challenging parts might have trouble with someone who is grieving the things that they just figured out they can't do anymore. And so just recognizing that everyone is in a different space, a different place in their journey, regardless of who they are. You could have two people with the exact same diagnosis for the exact same length of time with completely different experiences. Respecting that and owning the fact that my experience is valid and so is yours. And if we are not in the same place and we're not ready to have that conversation together, or this conversation puts me in a difficult place, it's okay to say, you know what? I'm going to support you from a distance and welcome you to find community in a place that is safe for everyone engaging in that conversation. I think that's so important. And I think it's important to affirm people in that way, letting them know that it is okay to take care of yourself. Because if not, you're going to end up with two people bleeding all over each other. And that's more harmful than good. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Allison. I'm going to invite one person online to vocalize into the room, but first I just want to remind folks to please, when you ask your question, stay who you are, just as an access practice. Marianne, I invite you to ask your question.
Thank you so much. Good morning. My name is Marianne Hobby. This, Allison, you have just, on so many levels. My disability, 12 years ago, I was disabled. I went from a marathon runner to be a quadriplegic. Mm-hmm. And then today I walk sometimes, and I walk awkwardly and weirdly, and, whatever, all those pieces. The idea of lament, for my own journey, which I've just written about, so I'm not here to take the space up to that, but I have adhered to hide, overcome, diminish, because I want acceptance and validation. See what I can do. Aren't I good? Aren't I grateful for all I have? Totally erasing and pushing down the loss and the anger. So thank you, because my opportunity to work with people, that's got to be acknowledged. It's ongoing. It doesn't just disappear. And what I would just so love to be in a church service, any denomination that for once acknowledges the lament Psalms because we know the Lord is my shepherd and we know all the pretty ones, right? I know them too. But if I didn't have those Psalms to rely on and go through and know that it's okay to have a temper tantrum and God's still going to love me anyway.
Yes.
If there's any response, I take it, because I'm going to make sure I get the printout and everything you've said, because I really need it and I needed you selfishly. Thank you.
Marianne, I appreciate that so much. And I would love to check out your work as well. Thank you. Yeah, it is so important to recognize that we don't have to protect God from our grief.
No.
He invites us to cast our cares and anxieties upon him. What are we hiding from him when he already knows? And why burden ourselves with carrying something that we weren't meant to carry by ourselves?
Thank you for this. I think it's a very important topic and an important life skill. And just something I wanted to add is, well, I started studying grief when I realized that although I'd pretty much adjusted to I have seizures, I had a spiritual loss every time I lost consciousness. And I work with that with my clients a lot. But anytime there's a change, we experience a loss.
Yes.
So I also had grief when I got control of my seizures and was able to drive, and I really missed riding with all of my friends. You know, so, and you have grief when you lose an expectation or a pencil. And I think just recognizing that grief is part of change.
Yes.
And that all change has some aspect of that in it. And when we're practiced at it, we're not in as bad of a situation when larger losses come up, because we know how to deal with the smaller ones. And so I think this is a really important topic, and thank you.
I appreciate you for raising that, because that is such a powerful thing. I think that sometimes we can misinterpret someone else's process and think that because they have navigated through one loss and they're doing okay, that there's not another shoe to drop. And we never know when that's going to happen. We never know when you've been working through something and all of a sudden you discover a limitation that you didn't realize was going to impact you a certain way. And now you're back at square one, going through the process again. And I think that it's important for us to recognize that for ourselves too, that we're not failing when we go through another cycle, that it's just part of the process. And that these are tools that we need to equip ourselves with and each other with, to be able to navigate that in the moment and say, it's okay that I'm here. It's okay that I'm processing and that I'm expressing and going through this grief journey the way that I need to, the way that's healthy for me.
Thank you so much. I know that there are so many more questions, friends, but we are almost out of time. So we're going to have just one more question online, and then the conversation can continue throughout the rest of the conference. Dr. Keys, I invite you to ask your question.
God bless you, Dr. Hampton. Wonderful as ever. I am Milton Keys from Indianapolis, Indiana. Quick question: as I'm hearing your lecture, I'm getting ready to do some writing and I'm reviewing my thoughts on the Odyssey. And now I'm wondering, how do we account for theodicy in this grief? Because what I'm hearing you say is you gotta let all the emotions go. That means even asking why there's bad things happen to good people. Well, I usually hate that question because I don't frame disability as bad. How do we space for the Odyssey without perpetuating bad theology?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Thank you, Dr. Keys. I think that we have to use that with in partnership with God, to be very, very mindful of the harm that it can cause at the right time. Just like anything else, the wrong medicine prescribed for the wrong condition can do more harm than good. And I think it's that same thing with theodicy. We have to gauge when people are ready for certain things, and offer them, not expecting them to take it on as their mindset or their worldview, but to provide everything as an option. That this is an offering for you when you're ready to embrace it. You know, we plant seeds. One plants, one waters, God gives the increase, right? And so all we can ever hope to do is share the things that maybe we've experienced, things that have brought us comfort, and not put pressure on ourselves or anyone else to make sure that they land. Theodicy is an important part of the discussion. You know, we understand that we live in a fallen world. All these things were introduced with the introduction of sin, all those wonderful theological things that we know and we discuss commonly. But when you're grieving, that can be helpful. It can be harmful. And so I think that we need to allow the person to guide the grief process and to guide our response and our ministry to them. We have to let them lead in their grieving, encouraging them to express it and receiving it as they give it. Again, going back to what I shared earlier, let them cry, let them yell, let them say things they don't really mean, and not bring it back to them, you know, and say, well, you said this. You know, they didn't mean it in the moment. We all do that. But just to give them a safe space where we're not preaching to them, but we're feeling with them and letting them guide the process in a way that's healthy for them. So that would be my response to the question of theodicy, because it does come up quite frequently. As we close, I thank you all for your questions and your engagement. I would be remiss if I did not dedicate this presentation to my eldest sister, Kathy. I received word about 1 o'clock this morning that she passed away in Indianapolis. And this presentation was largely inspired by her experience with prolonged grief. Grief that exacerbated existing chronic conditions. Grief that she never really found a way to manage in a way that proved healthy for her. Today, she is without grief. She is where there is no more weeping, no more wailing. And so I'm thankful that today, without even realizing, you have been my community, allowing me space to voice lament, to honor grief and its role in human flourishing. Thank you for being that for me today. Even as we celebrated Dr. Hardwick, and as we now celebrate my sister, thank you for this opportunity. And may we all continue to be community for one another, feeling with each other, celebrating, rejoicing with those who rejoice, and mourning with those who mourn. God bless you all. Thank you.